On this episode, I'm interviewing the owner and CEO of Charisma Media, Steve Strang. We talk about his book, God and Cancel Culture. We got a lot to cover, and we talk about the roots of cancel culture. We talk about what it is ultimately leading to, which is communism, and why that's the case. And we talk a lot about what God is doing in this time and why we should have hope and why we need to be standing strong with our Christian biblical convictions. You're not going to want to miss this, so let's get into it right now.
This is Your Faith at Work, the show that helps you get your faith out of the church and into the world. God is on the move right now in the marketplace and culture through people just like you. You were created for influence and impact. Let's take your faith to the next level. Learn more at ryanshoward.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ryan S. Howard.
Well, welcome to Your Faith at Work. I'm Ryan Howard, and I've got a very special guest with me today, Steve Strang, who is the owner of Charisma Media. He has published more than 2,000 books, including popular authors like Jonathan Cahn and John Hagee. And he hosts the Strang Report, which has millions of downloads. He's authored 7 books. He's been featured in nearly every Christian media outlet. He's been on Fox News, MSNBC, CNN. He's interviewed 4 U.S. presidents, and he was named by Time Magazine as one of the top 25 most influential evangelicals in America. And I'm happy to say he's a mentor of mine and a friend as well. So, Steve, welcome to Your Faith at Work.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I'm happy to be with you. And I don't know if people know that you are from Central Iowa, but I grew up there as a kid. So not many people know that. I actually lived just south of Waterloo, which is not too far from you.
Yeah, and that was how we had met. Was I had reached out to you when I ran for the Iowa House in 2020, and you had a connection. Believe it or not, that town you lived in was in the district I was running in.
I know, small world. And of course, you didn't contact me for that reason. You didn't know that. But I run into very few people from Iowa and even fewer people from Waterloo. And so that was just an interesting coincidence. You know, over time, I've had, connections with lots of people in lots of ways, but we've become friends since then. And I'm just so proud of the job you're doing. I think Your Faith at Work is important. We're glad to have it on the Charisma Podcast Network. And, even though you didn't win that race, you didn't lose it by very much. But, I just admire so much that you stood up and wanted to be counted and wanted to give leadership to your constituents there in Iowa. And of course, you got to do what you feel is important and how you feel the Lord is leading. But I hope you run again.
Yeah, well, we will see what God has planned. But I definitely agree. I mean, we need Christians to be influencing, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about today, and stepping up for that. And God, my wife and I really enjoyed running for office. We certainly learned a lot, and we'll see what God has planned in the future. So I want to talk today about, you've got a book that was published in 2021 called God and Cancel Culture. Stand strong before it's too late. And there's so much for us to unpack here. But before we get into that, maybe just get us up to date on what you're working on now, what we're going to see coming from Charisma and the magazine and Charisma Plus and all that. What are you working on now?
Well, Charisma Media is a lot more than just my podcast, which is now up to 16 million, which is a lot of people. But, there are podcasts in the country that are bigger, although I'm pretty sure mine would be in the top few percent. The biggest thing that we're doing this year is the release of Jonathan Cahn's new book called Return of the Gods. It'll be out September 6th, the day after Labor Day. It's absolutely his most explosive book. God has revealed to him some mysteries that he'll be unpacking. He's going to be on several programs between now and September 6th. Sid Ross is Supernatural, Jim Baker show. He's going to be on Voice with Jonathan Burness. I know those 3 for sure. And then after the book comes out, he'll be on a lot more media. We expect a lot of buzz about the book. I'd encourage people to go ahead and buy it ahead of time. It won't be released. They can buy it from mycharismashop.com, which is our our own direct to consumer site, but also christianbook.com and amazon.com are the two biggies, barnesandnoble.com. You can pre-order it. And that's very important because it gets a momentum going. And every one of his books has been on the New York Times, and we expect this to be on the New York Times bestseller list too. And that's not necessarily the goal, of course, but it just recognizes how many people resonate to this book. We have several 100,000 books ordered by the big booksellers that will be on the shelves September 6th. And that shows a lot of interest on their part. Of course, they've done very well with this book. Maybe I'm giving you too much inside baseball stuff about publishing, but this is big, and I'm being a little bit discreet about what the book says. I have read it, of course. In fact, I was with Jonathan Cahn only a couple of days ago going over a lot of these details. He has got a burning passion to get the word out. So do we. That is absolutely the biggest thing we're doing. And then almost as big is the book Harbinger Things to Come, which is a documentary basically on his most recent book that came out about a year and a half ago called Harbinger 2. And it was a Fathom event on May 12th. It was the number 2 movie in the country for that day. It was a Thursday. Only Doctor Strange was bigger on that particular day. It was so popular, they ran it a second time. It was the biggest Fathom event of 2022. And it is powerful. And there's an anointing on it. And in some theaters, which were very, very full, in fact, a lot of theaters opened a second screen because, the first one sold out. It was almost like revival broke out. People wanted to pray and praise the Lord. And you don't see many movies like that in theater. As we're recording this podcast, Salem Now has an exclusive for streaming. Liftable TV will have an exclusive, and then it'll be more widely distributed, including the DVD, up in September. This is a powerful documentary. It's the kind you want not only to watch, but let other people watch, because, God is saying something to America with all this mess that's going on. In fact, Return of the Gods, a new one, helps explain why all of this stuff that we never thought would happen is happening, and what it means, and what God's plans and purposes are. So that's the biggest thing we're doing. Meanwhile, I'm working on my next book, which will come out next May. That seems like an eternity, but it'll be here faster than you think. And it's going to be different than my last few books. It's going to be more in line with the purpose of Charisma Magazine, which is, in fact, next week. Of course, I know people listen to podcasts for a long time, but in early August, in fact, August 5th, Charisma will celebrate its 47th anniversary. A lot of people don't know we've been around that long, but we have. I mean, when I started Charisma, the personal computer was not yet available. And of course, it was, a couple of decades before the internet was out. A lot has changed since then, but Charisma has always been the magazine about spirit-led living. That was a little catchphrase we put on our first issue, and we have used it in various ways over the years. And, God is doing a lot in the world. There is a strong spirit-filled community. It's a minority, of course, of the population. But in fact, I was just reading a scientific report that's just come out about the population, and there are 21 million people who have claimed to have received the baptism of the Holy Spirit, who are trying to live by the power of the Holy Spirit, experiencing the gifts in various ways. There are a lot of different kinds of churches and so forth. It was very, very interesting. In fact, we will be reporting on it. But there's a lot of us out there. It's just that the culture has become more and more ungodly and unfriendly to Christians. Sometimes we feel like we're out there all by ourselves, but that's not really true. So my new book, and this may be the first time I've announced it. I don't know. There's not really a point in talking about it that early, but it's called Spirit-Led Living in an Upside Down World. And it's that we got to live by the Spirit of God to even survive. We can also be happy and have good lives, when we're living by the Lord, and to some extent we can ignore all that's going on, but also we have power to stand up to all this mess and to believe God to help turn some of it around. I mean, I'll look at it from a lot of different angles. It'll be, as I referred to, it'll be a much more spiritual book. I wrote 4 books on Donald Trump. They were very well received. A lot of those media interviews that you mentioned were about my Donald Trump books because there was so much interest in Donald Trump, of course. In fact, the president himself held up the book at the World Economic Summit. Somebody who was attending, who was reading it, handed him her copy to autograph. And while the cameras were all around, somebody must have asked him to hold it up, which he did. And of course, everybody was putting it on social media.
It's a great shot.
I'm sorry?
No, it's a great shot. Good picture. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was just a blessing from the Lord. I mean, they didn't do it as publicity. We had nothing to do. In fact, somebody said, "How did you get him to do it?" I said, "We had nothing to do with it."
Yeah.
It was just one of those serendipity things that happened.
Yeah.
And, but I just felt that after Biden was inaugurated and all that mess happened on September 6th, I just sort of didn't want to go there, but I knew that I had to comment on what's going on. And so that's when I wrote God and Cancel Culture. And really I could have called it God and being woke, or God and the upside down world, but cancel culture has been around. In fact, I've been invited to speak at Clay Clark's Reawaken America, the ones that he puts on with General Flynn, and he has speakers like Mike Lindell and Eric Trump, and it's been kind of neat to share the same stage. Of course, he's got lots of speakers, and he always has me speak on cancel culture. I think I've been to 6 or 7 of his events. And, I say that cancel culture's always been around. The Roman Empire tried to cancel Christianity. Of course, they were unsuccessful. The Roman Empire is long gone, and Christianity is still here, of course. And there's always been a struggle against good and evil. And even as a charismatic Christian who believes in the fullness of the Spirit, there are people in the church that try to cancel us. Over the years, there's certain Christian bookstores where the owner did not agree with speaking in tongues or whatever, and wouldn't carry our books or other books on similar topics. That is a type of cancel culture.
Yeah.
It's hard to sell books if you can't get them on the shelf.
Right.
Of course, they weren't nasty in the same way that people are nasty today, but it's not all bad news. In fact, I try to end on I can't even think what I want to say I want to end with hope, because there is hope. There's always hope. And there are good things happening. I go a lot into all the mess about cancel culture with COVID. In fact, to me, the real thing that happened with COVID was that there were a lot of leftist officials in our country who actually tried to shut down the church. And, they used a pandemic as an excuse. But I say it's a pandemic today. What's it going to be tomorrow? And they found out how passive Christians and churches would be to go along with it. Now, at first, we were told that there were going to be millions and millions of people die. It's sad that anyone died. But people die of the flu every year. Not as many, and it's not played up in the same way. the people dying of disease and different things is just part of life. We found out pretty soon that most people, survive COVID. I had COVID in December of 2020. It was a relatively mild case. To me, it was not a whole lot worse than the flu. I've had several friends, and in fact, one former staff member who've died of COVID. I don't want to take it lightly, but in California in particular, which was the worst, but it was many states as well, the governor said that people could not go to church. And if they did go to church, there could only be like maybe 10 or 25 people there, and they couldn't sing, et cetera, et cetera. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. I do a deep dive into that story. I tell about Che Ahn with his Harvester Church in Pasadena, where the city of Pasadena even went beyond Gavin Newsom and put a $1,000 fine per person if they attended church per service. So if 100 people attended a service, that would be $100,000 in fines. People came from other states to stand with him. A lot of people finally got a backbone and stood up to the government. Our constitutional rights do not go away when there is an emergency. They just don't. And the irony with Gavin Newsom in California is they allowed people in Hollywood in theaters to sing and dance and do all that kind of stuff, but you couldn't sing in church. They allowed liquor stores and marijuana dispensaries to stay open, as well as grocery stores and Walmart and all that kind of stuff. But if you went to church, you were going to be a super spreader. But if you went to marijuana dispensary, apparently you weren't going to get COVID. I mean, it defies common sense and logic. And thankfully, the Supreme Court struck it down. And thankfully, life is more or less back to normal. But these forces are going on, and many of them are anti-God. And when you drill down, a lot of this mess on the left is really socialism or some kind of American form of communism. They don't like to use the term because it's still an unpopular term, but a lot of these people believe in what Karl Marx said, and they're trying to impose it. And communism is always atheistic, is always totalitarian, and we are seeing a form of totalitarianism in our country that we've never seen before. I don't think it's too late, but people have to stand up. And that was part of why I wrote the book, was Christians have to stand up. Non-Christians are not going to stand up for our Christian values. They think, well, that's just too bad. They got to live with it. We all have problems. The press stands up for freedom of the press. I'm a member of the press. Got a degree in journalism. I believe in freedom of the press, but the press sticks up for freedom of press. The Christians and churches have got to stand up for religious liberties. And thankfully, we've got a number of organizations that do that. Liberty Council in Central Florida, not far from where I am. Kelly Shackelford, Jay Sekulow and his American Center for Law and Justice. There's a number of groups, very good groups, that are standing up, doing a lot, defending our rights in the court. Now that we have some Supreme Court justices who actually believe in the Constitution and what it says and believes that you just can't make up rights out of thin air and say they're in the Constitution, at least there's some hope. And so that's why I wrote the book, and I hope that's why people want to buy it. It's still out there. It's still for sale. In fact, this podcast with you is one of my first efforts to sort of relaunch the book basically a year after it came out. I want to give it another real thrust because I think the message is still as important now as it's ever been.
I agree completely. And I think, the book is filled with so many examples, but like you said, it doesn't end on the negative aspect. There's a lot of hope in this, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But I think one of the quotes in the book, I think you did, maybe just tell us, you did a lot of interviews. Just tell us briefly kind of the process you went through for your research and writing this book, and then we'll get into some of the specifics.
Well, that's a good question. I actually did 23 interviews. I know that because I recorded the interview usually on Zoom, and I would transcribe it and I would pull the quotes. And I interviewed some of these pastors like Cheon, Greg Farrington, who is right outside Sacramento. I focused a lot in California just because so much was going on. I also interviewed some of the lawyers, Matt Staver and others that I've mentioned. And then I ran all 23 interviews as a podcast. In fact, I have a podcast called God and Cancel Culture that's had almost 1 million downloads. People are interested in this. I wanted people to be able to find it as a podcast. With my main podcast is called The Strang Report. And I've got over 900 episodes and 16 million downloads. But I didn't want to make it sound like I was just pushing my book. So that's why I had the separate podcast. So anyway, I know, and if people want to, the interviews lent themselves to a podcast, but I wasn't literally doing a podcast, if that makes sense. I generally do an introduction, explain to the listener what they're going to hear, and then they can kind of hear my research. I'm a journalist. I report on what is happening. I sort of know, at least in a general way, who's making things happen. And I reached out to them and talked to them. My new book is going to be much less journalistic, and it's going to be much more personal, of where I have seen the power of God as a journalist covering the Spirit-filled community, now for all these decades. I have lots and lots of stories. It's going to be a much more a personal kind of book, and in some ways more difficult for me, because I don't know about you, but it's harder for me to reach down and to share my own feelings. In fact, as a journalist, you're trained not to even let people hardly know what your opinion is. You've got to be just absolutely dispassionate. At least that is how I was trained. Fairness and don't take one side over the other. A lot of that stuff is out the window now with the press being so biased toward the left. We could talk about that for a long time. And to some extent, I deal with that in the book. In fact, I even say that in some ways I'm ashamed of what the press has turned into. I started my career at the Orlando Sentinel. I'm almost ashamed to tell people that, because the Sentinel has turned into such a rag. And somebody asked me the other day if I subscribed to the Sentinel. I said, no way. No.
Right.
And that's true, of course. I don't mean to malign those people. I'm sure they have good people down there. No one is down there that was down there when I worked there. I mean, there's been that. For one thing, I was in my early 20s. So, most of the people are no longer with us, but times change. Back then, at least, back then the press was liberal. They really were. They were not friendly to the church. They were more friendly than now, or at least they would be a little bit more dispassionate. The Sentinel, for example, let me do an article on Catherine Kuhlman. It was written it was kind of an arm's length article, but the headline was The Incredible Catherine Kuhlman. And I wrote about one of her crusades and how people responded and claimed to be healed and all that stuff. They would never run an article like that today.
Yeah. And well, and that's, one of the things that I've always been impressed with and appreciated about Charisma and everything you're doing is not shying away from controversial topics, or maybe topics that are giving shedding light on a position that's not the so-called politically correct mainstream media position, and all that's being pushed by the left. That's the so-called only acceptable one. And that's something that really has attracted me to charisma and made me, just this, and the idea of this spirit-filled life, because that's what I'm trying to help people see, is to be spirit-led in their work, in their family, and now in culture and politics. And so I think that, that's sort of getting into this. I think you interviewed Mario Murillo in the book, or he was one of the interviews you had done. And he mentioned, I think there was a quote in there, him about saying that, we didn't really see or know how wimpy and divided and disconnected from reality the church was before COVID. And it sort of exposed all of that. And, that the church didn't preach the counsel of God to America and just wasn't fulfilling that role, which is what the way our nation was founded. Maybe could you just talk a little bit about, what we should see the church doing? What should the pulpits be talking about? I mean, should they be talking about these politics and controversial things? Or, what role should they be playing in this?
Well, I believe they should. And over the years, preachers have stood for righteousness, going all the way back to the First Awakening, up through the Revolutionary War. There were preachers who thundered against the tyranny of the crown and how we had to stand for liberty and those kinds of things. There are lots of stories, even of some of the founding fathers who were actually clergymen themselves. It was clergymen. It was the abolitionists. The abolitionists were Christians. They were the ones against slavery. They were. And if there were any that weren't actually churchgoers themselves, of course, back then being churchgoers much more common in the culture, but they were influenced by the abolitionists, who are the ones who ended slavery. Lincoln himself was influenced by that. And we can come right down through history. Now, a lot of pastors are timid. Churches tend to go liberal. There are some denominations. I hate to criticize specific denominations, but John and Charles Wesley were fiery men of God who founded the Methodist Church. The Methodist Church is a shadow of what it was. It's become liberal, like almost all the other denominations. And I really think that a lot of the pastors that are quiet and timid is just kind of, they're in the process of kind of going the same way. We need righteous people to stand up for righteousness. Now, Mario Murillo is a friend of mine, and not very many people know this, although it's not a secret, but I've known him since 1970. 1970, I was in college. He is a couple of years older than me. He already had a very strong ministry in California. In the early days of radicalism at University of California in Berkeley, he had a ministry called Resurrection City. I was powerfully influenced by Mario when I was 19 years old. I just was. And it's been kind of interesting to reconnect with him after all these years. He told me just really recently, in fact, I did a podcast with him on my Strang Report, that he would rail against these pastors. Actually, there are evangelical Christians, and evangelical means that basically you believe the Bible and you believe in salvation, you believe that Jesus is coming again, the basics of the truth. But there are even so-called evangelicals who are going woke, who are embracing critical race theory, who are embracing or at least including a lot of the gay agenda, things that are not scriptural at all. And he said he used to really rail against them. The thing is that the people he's railing against aren't, there. They don't hear him. They don't pay any attention to what Mario says. It's a little bit like, being a speaker somewhere, and there are a bunch of people that are late or maybe who didn't show up, and you're standing up there criticizing the people that didn't show up or the ones that are late. They never hear you anyway. But Mario says that he now takes a different stance in his meetings, that there are a lot of brave preachers like Greg Farrington and Cheon and the ones I mentioned, a lot of others who are standing for righteousness, who did keep their churches open even during the shutdown. And he encourages them. He also tells them, and I actually did a story on this on our charismanews.com website, that no, I'm sorry, it wasn't on the website. It's my column in the next issue of Charisma. I usually write on the website, but I just remember it was for my column in the issue that hasn't come out yet. He said he encourages these pastors in his meetings to stand up, and he says the place just goes crazy with applause because they're so proud of him. But he tells pastors, he said, you go back to your churches, you announce that next Sunday, people need to bring all their friends because you are going to give a very clear presentation of the gospel and tell about the cost of serving Jesus. He said your church will be packed and you'll have scores and maybe hundreds of people at the altar. He said, when you preach the gospel in an uncompromised way, even when you tell the people the cost of following Jesus, they respond. He says he's seen no one more open to the Lord in America since the days of the Jesus movement, which I remember because I'm that generation. But we had millions of hippies and former drug addicts come to Jesus. A lot of the Christians, a lot of the Christian leaders of today actually came out of the Jesus movement. And in some ways, I consider that I did too, because, we don't have time to go into my own testimony, but people are open. People are open, partly because things are such a mess. In fact, Jordan Peterson, the psychologist and college professor from Canada, who's really a philosopher, the one who wrote 12 Rules for Living, a book I've read twice. He did a video about 2 or 3 weeks ago called A Message to the Christian Churches, and he addressed it to the Catholics, the Orthodox, and the Protestants. And he talked about how young men in our culture, many of them are in their 20s and 30s, and they're adrift, they're not married, they live at home, they have no purpose in life. The culture tells them they need to almost be ashamed of being a male, that they're guilty of sexism and toxic masculinity, and they should apologize for being a male. They should apologize for even wanting to date a girl or marry her. He said, welcome these young men into your churches. In the church, men are still men and women are women, and getting married is a good thing. He said, put up a billboard. He said, these young men will flock to your churches. And I thought, why should a secular philosopher have to tell churches to do that? Now, we would add to that, you need to tell them about Jesus. But I just thought it was significant. It just shows what's happening in the culture. And so this is why I do what I do. It's why I'm writing this new book. It's why we give platform. A lot of what I do with Charisma Media is giving platform to others, including, our 250 podcasters like you and many others. In the 2,000 books, some of the authors did more than one books, but it would be at least 1,000 different authors we gave platform to. I think that that's very, very important. In fact, that's really what I've done in my career, is telling other people's stories, telling about revivals that have happened. There are a lot of good things. Listen, the mainstream media doesn't want anyone to even hardly know that there's anything good going on in the church. This has been going on for decades. Now they hardly want anyone to know that anyone's conservative, that anyone is standing up to the vaccine mandates, or that they're standing up to the school boards or anything like that. And if you do stand up, they want to make you sound like a pariah, like you should just be eliminated, from the culture. I mean, it's getting vicious. It's getting horrible. But you know what? The Bible explains this. It says we wrestle not against flesh and blood. These are not the people that are standing up being vicious, or the people in the media or the other institutions that are being so anti-God. Even Gavin Newsom, he's not the problem. And I'll just end with this scripture. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers and evil powers in high places. There is a spiritual dimension and a spiritual world that is more real than the world that we know. And you've got to your eyes have to be opened by the Spirit of God to even understand what I just said.
That's right. And it's God can reveal this to those who are seeking and want to know this, and he can, give us an understanding of that in our spirit. And I think, it's incredible what you said about how Jordan Peterson from the secular side has to be the one to call this out. And it reminds me of, I think it's 1 Corinthians 4:15 that Paul says, you've got 1,000 guides in Christ, and we don't have enough fathers. We don't have people who are leading the church, shepherds who are actually speaking into the realities of what's going on now and to where people are at. And I think Mario Murillo, in another interview I saw with him, he talked about stolen thunder, how it's all of these people like the Daily Wire talking about these things that the pulpits should be talking about and calling these things out. And he talks about the need to expose the corruption and these sorts of things. And that's a lot of what I really want to do, is just to help people to see what's really going on behind all of this. And, in your book, you have a chapter called it's not just cancel culture, it's communism. And so, and you alluded to a little bit of this and talked some about it, but I think you quoted someone saying that really China, I think it's Joel Kilpatrick, he said China is the greatest cancel culture in the world. And Trevor Loudon talked about how corporations are just going along with it because they see China becoming the leader. And, it's interesting. I see a lot of these corporations pushing their woke agendas here in the U.S., but you don't see the same things happening in their China branches. And so, I mean, you mentioned this need to sort of be able to take a stand and speak up. And you also interviewed Eric Metaxas, and he said, people not saying Hail Hitler in 1933 and 34, if they wouldn't say it, their neighbors would start to look at them funny, and they didn't want to lose their job. And so they just kind of went along with it. And then, not so long later, look at what we had. And they would just sort of look the other way. And so maybe could you talk a little bit about some of the parallels to communism, or where this is heading if Christians don't take their place and start to stand up and be willing to sacrifice for this?
Well, communism is always atheistic. It's failed everywhere in the country, in the world where it's happened, most recently in Venezuela. China is one of the most repressive countries in the world. And yet people that are making money with them, like these big companies, they just look the other way. A lot of these people are more loyal to the one world government. They talk about the Great Reset. We don't have time to get into it now, but, there's these globalists. They've been around for a long time, going back to the founding of the United Nations and the League of Nations before that. We could trace it right down. George H.W. Bush himself gave a speech and talked about the New World Order. We weren't sure at the time exactly all that meant, but there's people pushing for a one world government. Hey, guess what? The Bible talks about that in the end of time, right. The book of Revelation. I mean, these things are coming to pass before our eyes, but we can speak up. God has used people before. It may slow down. It'll happen someday. I personally hope it happens after I'm long gone. I don't want to have to personally live through that. The book of Matthew, I just finished reading the book of Matthew again, and it talks about how horrible it's going to be. The people are going to want the mountains to fall on them. They're going to be, so desperate, and, woe to the women that are pregnant at the time, because it's just going to be so miserable, and on and on and on. Eric Metaxas is someone who I consider a friend. I have a lot of respect for him. I have been on his radio show and his show on TBN a couple of times with my various books. He's a very strong and courageous conservative, and he has an interesting story. His father is Greek, and his father lived through the era after World War II in which Greece almost went communistic. And in fact, his father left Greece because of that and because of all the unrest in Greece. His mother was from East Germany, communist Germany. Mm-hmm. She fled. They met in the United States and got married, and they taught him as a small boy that communism is bad. And he always appreciated America more than his little friends who grew up in America, who just kind of took it for granted. And he makes this point. His mother took him when he was 10 or 11 years old. His mother took him back to East Germany to visit relatives. And this was before the Berlin Wall came down. And he saw the barbed wire and the dogs and the gun and the guards with guns trying to keep people in. And our southern border, our wall tries to keep people out. If America is such a horrible, racist nation, like the left likes to say, why are people risking their lives to get in, including a lot of people from Africa and the Caribbean who have come here? Millions, 3 or 4 million have come here. They would not move here. Dennis Prager, I heard him on an interview long ago saying in the 1930s, no Jew in the world was trying to move to Germany. None, because they knew what Hitler was, even though, it took a while for him to really show, the concentration camps, how bad it got. But he said, if America was racist, why would these black people be coming here? They wouldn't. Nobody, let alone several millions of people. Now in Germany, instead of the wall keeping people out, they were keeping the people in. Everybody was wanting to flee, including Eric's mother. And so he has a very interesting perspective that a lot of Americans don't have. And he's also a wonderful writer.
Yeah. What we're really seeing, what I really want the listeners to get from this is that it showed up in a small way and people just sort of went along with it. But there were people who could see the writing on the wall, who knew what was coming, and they went the other way. And we see that, that's what is happening here. And this cancel culture is really just a stepping stone to totalitarianism, which is what you talk about in this book as well. And we see sort of the gravity, the importance of standing up for this. And one of the things that really stuck out to me in some of our conversations, and we'll sort of wrap up after this here, but maybe talk briefly about self-canceling. That's something that just seems to be all around us. So could you say a few things about that?
Well, I believe that self-cancellation is the most scary or dangerous cancellation of all. We look at someone like Mike Lindell, who's been enormously successful. He's also a strong Christian. He has a very, very interesting testimony of where he was a gambling addict and a drug addict, and his life got entirely turned around. But he was a horrible person because he supported Donald Trump. And there are people that they've tried to ban him to punish him for backing the president, and then for having the audacity to say that maybe the election was stolen. Well, my book, A Guide Trump at the 2020 Election, I had a whole chapter on how or why Trump might lose. And one of them was if the election was stolen, and almost everything I cited happened. Sad. The only, give a disclaimer, the only thing is I did not know about the Dominion voting machines, but the fraud with the mail-in ballots and all that kind of stuff I predicted. And anyway, anyone who even says maybe the election was stolen is canceled. And Mike Lindell, he had 23 retailers, including Bed Bath and Beyond, that took his pillows out. Now, how in the world is selling a pillow tied to the politics of the president? I mean, do we not buy Tesla cars because somebody doesn't like Elon Musk?
Right.
And whatever. I mean, it's ridiculous. These companies ought to be neutral and let people buy a pillow if they want to. Now, you can still buy the pillow from other retailers, but people look at it and they think, oh, wow, look, Mike Lindell lost millions of dollars in business because he spoke up. If they can cancel him, they'll cancel me. I better be quiet. I better not say anything that offends anyone. And you know what? That means the bad guys don't have to come and cancel us one by one. We cancel ourselves. That is much, much worse. And, it's one thing to speak up about an election. Elections come and elections go. But if we are timid about the gospel, about speaking up about the Bible or what is right, and that as Christians, that's really what's dangerous. And when I have occasion to speak or be in the media like this, when I write, I try to sound the alarm to encourage people. We need to be courageous. And listen, look at Cheon. I've known him since 1985, literally. And we've been friends all these years. I've been to his church in Pasadena. He's a mighty man of God. He's got a lot of influence. He's got a whole network of churches that he's the head of. But he has always been quiet regarding politics. Listen, he risked everything by having church. $1,000 per person per service. When I wrote the book, we even tried to calculate how much the fines would have been had the Supreme Court not overturned it. It was impossible to even speculate. But you know what? He stood up and he was exonerated. Mm-hmm. I tell stories in my book of how people stood up and actually, a lot of times when you push back, the other side steps back and they don't necessarily change, but at least, you win the battle for now. So I hope people will read the book. If they go to my own website, they can get it for half price, plus it's autographed. I've autographed boxes of books so that when people buy them, they're personally autographed by the author. And my website is my name. It's SteveStrangBooks.com. That's Steve Strang and the word books with an S, all pushed together like one word. And the book is normally $24.99 if they buy it at Barnes & Noble, but it's $12.50. Plus the ones at Barnes & Noble aren't autographed. So that's a special I can give to your listeners. And also see, what kind of response we get from your podcast. And I will say that with your permission, I'm going to run this on my own podcast. Of course, I'll put an introduction to explain people what they're listening to, and I'll encourage them to subscribe to your Faith at Work podcast, because I believe what you're doing is very important. And you build podcasts by, people hearing about it, listening to it, liking it, sharing it with friends, all that kind of stuff. So forgive me for the shameless promotion, but hey, I believe in this book and I want people to get a copy. In fact, you can buy a couple copies. Two books are the price of one, and they're autographed. Some people, like that. In fact, I've gotten autographed books over the years, and I saved them because I don't know, they're just kind of special. And I like to tell people, when I'm dead, it'll be worth something. So get it now and hang on to it.
Get it now. Well, as we close here, I want to end on we've sort of already come to a high note here, but let's talk about just real briefly. I know I think there's a quote in the book from Bob Jones that said that we're going to see a shaking in the government like we've never seen before. This will cause America to examine its foundations and invite God to influence in political and civic life again, where we started with freedom of religion, and we need to get back to that. And I think, Bob Jones, like I said, Rick Joyner, John Paul Jackson, Mario Murillo, all these guys, and I think yourself as well, are talking about a great awakening, a revival that's beginning or will soon begin. Maybe just talk briefly about that, and then we'll close on that.
Well, as a Christian, I believe that what is really important is not which political party's in office, whether taxes are high or low, or our economy is booming or not. The real thing is spiritual, because really we're spiritual beings and we're going to live forever, either with God or eternally away from God. And a revival is to revive the spiritual fervor of our nation and of a person's own life. And there have been many great revivals throughout history. If we had time, we could go into them. But even the Protestant Reformation was a revival, the Pentecostal revival. in the early 1900s. And there's many examples, including the first and second Great Awakenings. The Jesus movement was a great revival. The Roman Catholic charismatic movement was a great revival. And there is something happening. And there are many people that are, and even with all this persecution, let's say, people are coming to the Lord in numbers that Mario Murillo believes is greater than anything since the Jesus movement. And while I can't prove it statistically, or at least I haven't researched where I could, I believe that's true based on being an observer of what's going on. So there's always hope. You know, one of my favorite verses is all things work together for good to those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. And that scripture is true in good times, bad times, in communist countries and democratic countries. It's just true. And we have to believe that. That's part of what keeps me going and what can keep any Christian going, even when there are a lot of things to look at that would ordinarily make you discouraged.
That's well said. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining. I think we covered a lot. There's a lot more we can cover, but really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you, Ryan. And thank you for what you're doing. And on a personal note, thank you for your friendship.
All right. And I would say the same. Thank you as well. Well, and to our listeners, you can find more, like Steve said, at stevestrangbooks.com. And you can also find more previous episodes of Your Faith at Work at ryanshoward.com. And while you're there, make sure to sign up for my weekly newsletter and be sure to share this episode. Don't let yourself be canceled either by yourself or others. Make sure we're standing strong. Thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe, and you can help spread the word by leaving a 5-star review and sharing it with your friends. Visit ryanshoward.com to learn more about living the intentional, influential, and impactful life you were created for.